Hey everybody, it's Dr. Eric Balcavage. We're back for another edition of the Thyroid Answers podcast. We have another guest today. His name is Dr. Brady Wirick. He's a chiropractor, functional neurologist, functional medicine practitioner, and a friend of mine I've known for almost probably 15, 20 years maybe at this point.
Yeah, it's been a while.
It's been a while, right? So Brady, welcome to the Thyroid Answers podcast, and tell a little bit of the listeners a little bit about your background, how you got into what you're doing. And then our topic today is going to be something that influences everybody's health and well-being, and that is weight and the tie to blood glucose regulation is going to be our topic and theme for the day. So first, who's Brady and why should we pay any attention to him?
We should ask my wife that question.
That might be a longer discussion.
No, I'm like I said, my name's Brady Wirick, and I've been practicing now for about 18 years, practicing functional medicine, functional neurology, chiropractic, even some regenerative medicine back in the day. I say that I still do regenerative medicine. We were having a conversation before we started recording. So how did I get into this? That's a long story that I'll try to keep super short. When I was living in Texas and met a man that was a chiropractor, had no idea what chiropractic was, but I knew he was helping people and he was doing it without drugs. So I jumped into, undergraduate work, got into chiropractic school, went to chiropractic school in Texas, and while I was there, discovered this whole thing of functional neurology. And it blew my mind. So one thing after another, just here we go. Got into practice. I moved. I'm originally from Utah. I literally moved to Idaho to practice for the fishing, which still I have a tendency of doing that quite a bit. So when you ask who's Brady Wirick, I'm just a guy that likes to fish. So,
but at this point, right, beyond the fisherman, beyond the guy that knows how to row boats down a river, right, or rafts or whatever it is, you also now specialize in your practice on helping people try to lose weight naturally, right? And we're in a time, well, it's a constant theme that everybody's got, especially January, February. This is every expert comes out of the closet and starts telling people, hey, this is the way. This is the new diet. This is the way to lose weight. This is the magic supplement.
Here's the best workout.
Right. Here's the magic drug to help lose weight and maybe regulate blood sugar. And now we're going to talk to you about this. Somebody might be like, well, I just listened to 5 people on Instagram tell me the secret. Here's the 5-step secret, which is usually the red flag for me that you should run when somebody says, I have the 5-step secret, right? But let's talk about how big a problem weight and obesity is in this country. And what do you think is the biggest drivers causing the weight and obesity challenges we have today in this country?
The problem is 80 to 90% of us are overweight.
Why?
The answer I want to give you is because the drug companies have been lying to us for so long. We're misinformed. So we've been eating processed foods now for going on, since 1950. So we're pushing 70 years of processed foods and no thought of looking into what the food supply is doing. We're still just stuck on this whole calorie in, calorie out model, which I love it, because when you post something on TikTok, right, you always get the gym bro. It's a thermogenic reaction. It is. Yeah, maybe if you're 20, but and yes, I'm with you on that, Eric. It makes me roll my eyes too, because it seems like that age number is getting dialed back and dialed back. Right? And a very apparent example to me. Have you seen the show Lessons in Chemistry? Okay, you and Kelly need to hack out some time to sit down and watch this series. It's on Apple TV. Okay, you'll love it. Mainly because you think like I do. So it's about a gal that is a chemist in the 50s, which means she's treated like a secretary, not a chemist. I'm not going to give the story away to you, but there's a scene where she goes to a grocery store. She ends up as a host of a popular cooking show because she actually gets into the chemistry of cooking, and it's super cool. Hey, but there's a scene where she's in a grocery store and her little daughter brings up a box of cereal to her, and she turns and reads the label on the cereal, and there's a chemical in that cereal, and she looks at her daughter and goes, "Honey, that's jet fuel. You don't want to put that in your body." And then the sponsor of the show, the manager of the show, brings in a sponsor that's basically wanting to push Crisco. Right? So he's wanting to push a vegetable-based oil, which we've known has been bad for us forever, but she won't do it. And it causes this big rift because she goes on air and she's like, well, the people who pay for this show want me to push this crap, which will kill you. So we're going to use this instead. So she uses beef tallow.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, holy crap, we've known about this forever.
Yeah. So it's an ongoing issue, right? That we eat probably a lot more processed foods than we've ever eaten. And that is probably one of the biggest contributors to weight gain versus calories in, calories out. Now, the calories in, calories out thing, I think there's some science to that where, hey,
absolutely,
I got to have a certain amount of calories. I burn a certain amount of calories. But for the listener, the reason why it doesn't really work out completely the way some people think it would is if it was that simple, then you could just eat 500 calories less every day, and in 10 years, you'd be gone. Right? Because if it's calories in, calories out, it would be that simple. The problem is that's not how physiology works.
Yeah, I dare you. I dare you to say that to the 35-year-old mom that's absolutely grinding herself into the ground on a treadmill and eating, cucumbers all day long, and she's dying. Like, I dare you to tell that to her.
Well, I have to sometimes because some of these are my clients, right? So
no, I'm just saying, like, I dare you to say that's just a calorie problem.
Right.
And then she'll turn around and say, well, if it's a calorie problem, why the hell do I feel the way I do? And I'm not losing weight.
Oh, yeah. You're talking about the other way, right? So somebody says calories in, calories out. We tell people that all the time when they're overweight, that the reason you're overweight is because you eat too much calories and you don't exercise enough. But then if we really look at their diet and their nutrition and their lifestyle, actually do what we should be doing as clinicians, we might look at that and say, this person they're eating appropriate calories, they are doing appropriate activity and exercises, and yet they're still storing calories as fat. Then we would have a different conversation, but we typically don't do that. We just make the assumption that it's a calories in, calories out, lack of activity, lack of exercise. And we don't even really do a great job talking about maybe sometimes what you are eating or aren't eating. So it's a huge issue, right? I think it's 60% of the US population is thought to be overweight or obese. I think those numbers are continue to climb. And if you think about it from and this is the Thyroid Answers podcast, so we talk about this maybe from a thyroid perspective. Some people might blame it just on thyroid physiology, and I think that's not appropriate either. I think what we need to consider is why is the body all of a sudden we have this explosion of overweight and obesity when we have the greatest abundance of healthy whole food we've probably ever had. What else is going on here? But this is a huge, massive problem, and it's too simple of a problem to kind of just say it's just a matter of too much or too little calories. And if we think about from this thyroid perspective, if you consume, the way metabolism should work is if you consume more calories than your body needs, the minute you start storing calories into your fat cells start to release leptin. Leptin increases the conversion of T4 to T3. Signals go to your brain, stop eating, and increase activity and mobility and burn the stuff back off again. That is healthy metabolism, right? And so people overeat calories all the time and they burn them off. Everybody knows somebody that eats more than they do and is skinnier than they are. And we all know somebody who eats way less than we do, and they exercise more than we do, and yet they're still overweight, right? So it can't be that simple, calories in, calories out. There's a bigger piece to the issue. And you think a big part of that is the types of foods we're eating.
Oh, 100% it is. So when I sit down with people and talk about our weight loss program, I've got to get them from this idea and concept that they're going to come in and think that I have some magic exercise program where they're going to start melting fat away, melting calories away. And it's not that. It's this whole, our good friend Dr. Andy Barlow and his web of physiologic dysfunction. We have to start piecing that, figuring out what those pieces are. But I can say, after doing this for a while, that there's 4 main pillars that we address that need to be, that make our program what it is. Number 1 is we have to look at insulin and glucose metabolism. Because if your blood sugar is dysregulated, you eat something and you get an overreaction of glucose into your system, that's going to drive insulin through the roof. And guess what insulin turns excess sugar into? Fat, so you can store it.
So let's pause right there and talk about this for a second. So first, let's have the discussion of how food, let's just talk about the simplicity of food being consumed and how that becomes very simple. Let's just talk about food, how it becomes glucose in the bloodstream, and then how that glucose gets into the cell and used.
That's a great segue for our blood sugar mastery course, Eric, because it's in there. No, it's a simple process. Right? You eat a complex or a simple carbohydrate, and your body is going to break that down into glucose. You could probably tell me what the chemical structure of glucose is off the top of your head. I have to look at it. But the whole goal is to get your food broken down into glucose. Okay, so if you're consuming sucrose, which is table sugar, it doesn't take very long. Okay, so all of a sudden glucose is released into your bloodstream. Your lovely brain senses that and releases insulin from your pancreas. And pancreas is like the gatekeeper that allows the cell to open up so glucose can get into the cell. But if there's too much, that's when it starts converting it into fat.
Or there's other factors that play in, right? So
sure. I'm oversimplifying it, but
once that glucose gets into the cell, right? Now we need to do something with that glucose, right?
Right.
And what's the process? What are we doing with that glucose?
That's when we start to go into a complex series of chemical reactions known as the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain, where in the mitochondria, where it is converted into what is called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, which is literally your body's cache for energy.
Right. So we're taking food energy and converting it into cellular energy that we can use to do a whole bunch of actions.
Not just inside the body. We are literally taking glucose and turning it into electricity.
Mm-hmm.
That's awesome.
And so why would a cell not want glucose? I hear people talk about, are the people eating too much glucose? I hear people say the problem is insulin, the problem is glucose. Where do you stand on what the problem is?
It could be multifaceted.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so when you say why wouldn't the glucose want to get into the cell? Well, insulin resistance is basically a condition that happens when there's so much sugar in blood, there's so much blood sugar at the cell that the insulin receptor can't deal with all of it. And so you literally get this situation where you become resistant to insulin doing its job. Okay? But the question is why? Why does that happen? And I think the new way of thinking about this, which, number one that we talked about was insulin and glucose regulation. Number two is inflammation. Okay, you literally, we're at a point now where the foods that you eat, the processed foods that you eat, can cause a dysregulation in your immune system, which will literally cause your immune system to attack the insulin receptors on the cell, and that creates an insulin resistant situation.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of nuances here, right? One of those is that, and for the listener, Brady's exactly right. We eat food and food turns into glucose. Glucose needs to get into the cell. And the problem is we blame it often on insulin. The cell's
Right.
insulin resistant. And we sometimes in our discussion, we say, well, the cell's full of glucose. And this is the argument for you're not exercising enough to empty out the cell and then create more need for glucose. There's another issue here, and it hints to what Brady was talking about, and that is that cells operate in one of two modes. They're either in a low stress mode, and we talk about this all the time in the podcast, talk about this in the book, is that cells operate from low stress, we call manufacturing mode, where they need a lot of resources. They need glucose, they need fat, they need amino acids, they need all these things to make all these hair and skin and sex hormones and neurotransmitters and all these great things that make us feel good and function good. Or they're in a cell stress, cell danger response. And in that situation, they stiffen their cell membranes and they're reducing the amount of nutrients coming into the cell, whether it's amino acids to make peptides and proteins, whether it's glucose, whether it's iron, whatever, they're reducing the transport of things into the cell. Now, why would a cell do that? Because if there's a bacteria, a virus, organism threat, why would you bring more resources into the cell? And so the cell still may not have sufficient levels of glucose inside the cell, but the cell is signaling that, hey, we got danger here. We don't want to bring a lot of resources in. And that, in my opinion, is the biggest driver of glucose resistance. Just so you know, I hate the term insulin resistance because I think insulin gets a bad rap, but glucose is not getting into the cell, not because in many people that the insulin receptors failed to work or they forgot how to work. Now, there are mechanisms that you're, especially about what you're talking about, of antibodies and things that can impact insulin receptors. But I really think insulin gets a bad rap because there are 4 mechanisms by which we increase glucose beyond just what we're eating, right?
Right.
And so if we're getting glucose into the system from food and we have problems with excessive glucose being driven or not shut off in the body due to various stress responses, now we're going to have excess glucose in the system, even when we're in a fasted state and even when we have sufficient insulin, because the cells don't want it. They may send signals to the brain and say, hey, we need more. That's why your brain may say, hey, I need more carbs. I need more carbs. I need more carbs. But ultimately, I think so many people are in a chronic stress response. And I agree with you that one of the huge factors that may be creating that cell stress response is the chronic consumption of processed frankenfoods that are loaded with things that in time become toxic to our system. Would you agree with those ideas and concepts?
100% amen. And there's a couple more layers we could even throw into this, Eric, that first off, I'm never going to call it insulin resistance again. I love that glucose resistance, and I'm adopting that from here on out. While you're talking about this, I have these patients that still have this idea that it's okay to have a Coke Zero on occasion. So let's talk about what artificial sweeteners do to this whole concept, because they're not helping. These I was in church one day. Can I tell a story?
Sure.
So I'm in church one day, and someone from the congregation goes up and starts talking. And she was doing a lovely job of, you know, bringing people in. You know, if you're depressed, you know, come get a hug. You know, I have depression. Let me help you out. Blah, you know, I was really being a jerk because she was saying something very, very like kind and loving. And anyway, I know for a fact this lady drinks. I shouldn't say lady because you can just really start to narrow it down. She drinks a lot of diet soda. So while she's up there talking, I pull out my phone and I start doing what nerds do, right? Start looking at the effects of aspartame.
Mm-hmm.
And I pull up an article with the NIH from the NIH, which is the NIH 100% trustworthy? No. In 1981, there was a law that was passed that says drug companies can pay NIH researchers for the products that they help develop. I don't remember the name of the law, but it's a real thing. But anyway,
minor conflict of interest, right?
Just slightly. Baird's. Anyway, I'll send you. I did a blog post about it. I'll send you the blog post so you can see the name of the act. So I start looking at the effects of aspartame, and I find a NIH study that's like, well, aspartame's a little bit is okay because your liver flushes it out. And oh, by the way, aspartame turns into formaldehyde, but it's fine because it's not enough to do anything. I'm like, that's not fine. So I start digging into what does formaldehyde do? Guess what? Side effects of formaldehyde. Obesity, blood sugar dysregulation, diabetes, Alzheimer's, dementia.
Right. And why would all those things go together, right?
So,
formaldehyde is it's toxic, right?
Yeah.
So if you have a toxin in the system, and for the listeners, this is what we were getting back to. As you start to accumulate more toxins in your system, right, that triggers cell stress signaling, triggers inflammatory mechanisms. It creates this cell danger response in the cells and tissues that are impacted. You reduce the absorption of nutrients inside the cell. You become resistant to not just glucose. You become resistant to the amino acids that you're taking because you can't get those in. You become resistant to thyroid hormone because the cells are saying, hey, we're not going to convert T4 to T3. So this constant bombardment of these safe alternative chemicals, if somebody says, hey, well, they don't cause this issue, but we're not looking at the long-term complications of the accumulated load of a lot of these things, correct? We're looking at something in a small window for a small period of time by itself versus, nobody lives in that little window, right? They're also consuming other artificial sweeteners and glucose and everything else. And it's the accumulation of these toxins and stuff that creates this bigger cell stress response. Is that fair?
Amen. And before you get to that spot, which by the time you switch to Diet Pepsi, you're probably already there anyway. When you drink that stuff, your brain still has a reaction like it's having sugar. Mm-hmm. So you still get an insulin surge. It's not doing you. You're not getting calories. Coke Zero has 0 calories. Well, Good job, guys.
Yeah. Well, everybody's got a marketing strategy, right? Let's find the next thing that people can take, then we can kind of market it as something that's healthy or safe. We see that all the time with food labeling and problems. But it is, I think, the simplest thing for the average person who's overweight, who has pre-diabetes or diabetes, is to understand that all of these things are addressable and fixable. The reason you have diabetes, the reason you have glucose resistance, the reason you have obesity is because at the end of the day is a chronic inflammatory process triggered by diet, lifestyle, habits, behaviors, thoughts, actions, and it's not your genetics per se, right? It's not laziness. And for a lot of people, for some people, it's lack of activity, but I think we often say the reason you have your health issues because you're overweight and obese, just lose weight. And the reality is the reason they are overweight and obese is because they had a chronic health problem first, right?
It is a symptom of something else that's going on.
Right. So let's start with giving people some real suggestions and real answers. If they have weight, they're gaining weight, they've got a metabolism that's working appropriately. Where should, if they've got weight issues, blood sugar issues, pre-diabetic, diabetic, belly fat, like what's the foundational things that they should be considering if they want to start to improve their health and lose excess body fat?
Here's how the conversation goes when someone comes into me to do just that. Hey, number one, we have to treat this like it's a glucose problem. And this happened yesterday. I was doing a talk, consulting with somebody, and well, my blood sugar's fine. She's 80 pounds overweight. Mm-hmm. Hey, just because the labs for your blood sugar come back normal doesn't mean that there's not an issue.
So what lab you and I know, or probably we're thinking about, what is she potentially, or her medical physician, using as the indicator of normal blood sugar? That
a lot of them, if your glucose is normal and normal is getting pushed out to 120 deciliters, I'm brain farting on the
fasting glucose, or hemoglobin A1C, or insulin, C-peptide.
For blood sugar, it's 180 to 99 milligrams per
deciliter.
Yeah, that's what I was brain farting on. And if they don't go beyond that, they're not going to run A1C because their blood sugar is fine. Right? Or if they do, A1C, you're just looking at a percentage of glycosylated hemoglobin, which basically means that your blood sugar has been so high that your excess is actually bound to your red blood cells. But if those things are fine, then you don't have a blood sugar problem. You're just overweight and you need to burn calories. And that's not always true.
Yeah. So she could have, listen, for the listener, typically we look at blood glucose regulation, maybe 82 to maybe 88 as, like, we would say, an optimal range. Everything has to be interpreted. But if you're in that range, many of us in functional medicine might say, hey, that you're in the optimal range. The lab reference range might be as low as 65, and as Brady just said, as high as 120, and you're considered not diabetic yet. They get concerned about diabetes or pre-diabetes once that blood sugar stays above that 120 number, 126, and that when it starts to climb up, that might trigger something called a hemoglobin A1C to say how much glucose is sticking to your red blood cell. And if that's still within a reference range of 5.6, then they may say, hey, you're not diabetic, you're not pre-diabetic, although you're developing the process. But from a lab perspective, you could have a normal glucose at 84. The difference is how much insulin does it take to maintain that level? Or there's two markers we can look at, right? Insulin and C-peptide. But that's the thing we want to know is how much insulin does it take to maintain an 84? If Brady has a blood sugar of 84 and it only takes, his insulin's 4.2, it doesn't take him much insulin to maintain a healthy blood glucose. But that patient of yours came in and she's 80 pounds overweight, she might have a normal, optimal glucose of 84, but it's taking her insulin of 28, right? That means it takes a lot more insulin to try and force that glucose into a cell somewhere. And guess which cell is going to get it? It's probably the adipose tissue in the liver that are going to be storing it all, right?
That's exactly right. I addressed this in my blood sugar course. There's actually a whole day dedicated to lab tests, just so people could actually start looking at their own freaking labs. It bugs me that we have practitioners that will look at blood sugar and say, well, I think you're pre-diabetic, but it's no big deal. Let's keep an eye on it. No, it's a huge deal. Mm-hmm. Because that's the trigger for you to get your butt in gear to start eating foods that aren't going to spike your blood sugar, to start moving your butt. You know, we kind of got off the whole insulin receptor thing, and I wanted to make this comment earlier. I'm going to say it now. There's actually data that suggests there's 2 points of data I want to talk about. Hey, number one, there is data suggests that if you put in 40 minutes of aerobic exercise, I think 4 times a week, your cells actually create new insulin receptors so they can suck up all the glucose that they can get. That's awesome. Moving your body, you can actually make your body more receptive to insulin. The other thing that's out there is you can, if you go for a 15-minute walk after each one of your meals and start that meal with a sip of apple cider vinegar to get your gastric juices flowing, you can reduce your blood sugar spikes by as much as 40% just doing those 2 simple things.
Yeah. So those are good things, but I want, before we get into that piece of it, because this, if somebody's overweight already and has pre-diabetes or glucose issues, they may already, we don't want to be like, oh, we don't want to be doing the same thing. You need to eat less and exercise more. But let's talk about, without labs, before we get to labs, if you're overweight, what are the foundational things that they should think about? Pre-diabetic, diabetic, overweight, regardless of what your labs say, we know there's a systemic inflammatory process going on. So what are the foundational things before you even worry about what doctor do I need to see? What do I need to do different? What should everybody do? Make sure they're checking the box on themselves. Kelly and I call the fitness factors in our book. Yep. What are the foundational things they have to take into consideration as a self-check?
Well, you've said them: blood sugar and inflammation.
Well, what should they eat? Let's talk there.
Okay, you're right, and I get into this in the course as well. So what I have my people do is, number one, I have them start intermittent fasting. So I have them eating lunch and dinner. So they're eating in an 8-hour window. They're fasting for 16 hours. We could go on for an hour about what happens when you do that. I know that about 22 hours is optimal, but 16 hours for an 85-year-old woman is tough. So I'm going to take what I can get. So we start with that. And then we base their meals off of whole foods that are low glycemic. So protein sources, I tell them carnivore-based proteins. And I literally have them eating 4 to 6 ounces of protein, 4 ounces of fresh fruit, 4 ounces of fresh vegetables for lunch and dinner, with low glycemic snacks in between, as much as they want. Okay. So protein sources, we think carnivore. Vegetables, we have everything except, I can't talk today, Eric, any fresh vegetable except for potatoes, corn, peas, or carrots, because of the insulin surge that they'll cause. And yes, I live in Idaho, and I tell people they shouldn't have potatoes right now. Hey, and then any fresh vegetable except for bananas, pineapples, mangoes, and grapes.
Okay. So we're talking step one is to eat a whole food based diet.
Absolutely.
Right? Now, there's a lot of whole food based diets. There's carnivore, there's paleo, there's vegan, there's vegetarian. And we've circled the wagons in our space, and we shoot in at each other, like which whole food based diet is the best.
And the thing of it is, Eric, is like people when they go from standard American diet to eating any of the above that you just mentioned, they are going to feel better because they lower their toxic load.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah, I agree. And so that my argument is we're shooting in instead of saying, hey, any whole food based diet is probably going to be better than a processed food based diet. And depending on what your goals are and what you're trying to accomplish, any one of those versions of a whole food based diet may make you feel better, at least temporarily, because it's going to change your biome and potentially change to some degree your body's ability to heal and repair. Because if you don't tolerate fibers very well because of the bacteria that you've grown in your GI tract, then taking some time away from those fibrous-based plants may allow the immune system to calm down, change the gut flora. And then when you start to slowly put them back in, maybe they create less of an issue. So any of the whole food-based diets, but a whole food-based diet would be foundational to start, right?
Absolutely. And my opinion of this is biased because I'm not going to ask people to do anything that I'm not willing to do. And I love meat, so I am not going to ask people to stop eating meat. So my thing is like, I don't like using the word paleo, but I do, just because when you search for a recipe and you put the word paleo in front of it, you're going to find an adaptation of your favorite recipe in a whole food form.
Mm-hmm.
So what I say is any food that was not available 100 years ago, you probably shouldn't eat.
So then why are we giving whole food based plants and we're trying to get those things out? Do you think in general bananas and potatoes and things are generally bad for our health? Or do you think those things are challenges for the person who already has blood glucose dysregulation and the added carbohydrates, added glucose in those types of foods that you said avoid these if you've got blood sugar problems because there's a lot more glucose in them?
Yeah.
Is it they're unhealthy in general, or just, hey, these are things you got to manage while you have poor glucose regulation?
So those are foods that they should avoid until we get them to their goal weight.
Okay.
A banana will not cause you to gain weight, but it will slow you down. Okay.
In the process of getting healthy.
In the process of getting healthy, they're not going to cause you to gain weight. They'll just slow the process down. Hey.
Okay.
Now, potatoes and corn, I can make a pretty solid argument that they will cause you to gain weight, especially if they're not organic. But I don't know if you want to open that can of worms or not.
Sure. Because I mean, it's a whole food, right? There's whole communities that potatoes are a mainstay of their diet nutrition. Go to Peru. I mean, it's the foundation of their culture.
I'm pretty sure the farming techniques in Peru are not what they are here.
They're slightly different for sure.
Every now and then. So I live in potato country.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if I look out, I can look at, I'm in my house right now. I'm looking out my living room window and I can literally see one of those gigantic pivot sprinklers.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, every now and then there will be an infestation of is it a nematode? I don't remember, but they'll have to put a chemical on the soil and they literally have to cover the soil with a tarp to keep the chemical in. Mm-hmm. and to keep it from leaching out because it's toxic.
Yeah.
And there will be a period of time that field is not usable. But is it really? I just have my doubts that stuff's not getting into the product for decades or for generations to come.
Oh, yeah. So mass farming is even though they're now, I just saw somebody posted something at the biggest potential problem to global warming is personal farms and private gardens, and the problem all the problem it has, and why mass crop farming is better for the atmosphere and carbon dioxide.
Right, because that crop duster it's not flying right now because it's February and it's snowing outside, but how much fuel is that crop duster burning to drop all that glyphosate on that product?
Right. And so if you're eating cleaner, whole food based products, less toxins into the system that can trigger the immune, the inflammatory response, then it may be less about the food itself and the glucose percent that's in there and more about the chemicals that are in there that create stress and inflammation and damage and permeability that drive the danger signals that then make the glucose that's in that food not accessible to the cells and tissues. And then that has to be stored as fat. Is that right?
Eric, if we could take and bracket what you just said and get everyone to understand that, we have just bankrupted the pharmaceutical world.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't ever have, but
that would change. Look, if everybody understood that, that would absolutely change the landscape of healthcare.
Yeah. Oh,
because that's it.
Yeah. And the challenge is many of the things that we talk about that go on our food and on our plants and into the soil to have bumper crops that look beautiful, that don't have blemishes on them, that make it easier to farm, easier to harvest, while many of those chemicals by themselves may not create a one-shot short-term toxicity. It really is and does become the accumulation of these things over time and how those chemicals impact our gut biome that really drives a lot of the chronic immune inflammatory issues. I really think, and I think you would agree, that it's less an issue of whole foods being too much glucose in this one, too much in that one, too little fiber. This one's all these things are in nature for a reason, and there's a value and a benefit to them. It's when we mass consume them in a adulterated form that it becomes a problem, and when we're consuming stuff plus all the toxicity that comes with it in an effort to make it abundant, that we start to set the stage for chronic inflammation, glucose resistance, and chronic illness. So good. So we've got this, hey, we got to go to a whole food based diet. That's our starting point.
Yep.
Fasting is something that you discussed, and a person who's been on the podcast, Cynthia Thurlow, she's made her career about talking about intermittent fasting. There is a conversation that goes on in the community that if somebody has a blood glucose regulation issue, they can't do intermittent fasting. They need to eat every 2 to 3 hours. And there's another conversation, especially in the thyroid community, that if you have a hypothyroid condition, you can't do intermittent fasting because it's going to cause more hypothyroidism. So I want to get your opinion on the first one and why you think if somebody's got a blood glucose regulation issue, intermittent fasting is good versus harmful or problematic, like some people would say.
I think the difficulty in that is everybody is different, right? So even when people come into my office, I want them to intermittent fast if they're able. Right. And we just have people that just flat aren't.
What do you think the mechanism? Because there's people listening to this saying, I'm one of those people. I can't go more than 2 to 3 hours without eating something. And you're going to tell me I need to go 8 hours, 16 hours? It's not possible. So what do you think is the mechanism for most people as to why they may not be able to? Why are they getting those cravings every every hour, every 2 hours? What's causing them to crave carbohydrates and sugars and not be able to go without eating?
Well, when you say crave, like you just said it, it makes me think of adrenal dysfunction.
So explain that for me. Because I hear that term too, because people throw that out there and they say, well, it's adrenal dysregulation. But what's dysregulated? They're not making cortisol. Why would that be important in somebody who just ate? Is it too much cortisol, too little cortisol? What are we saying when we say that?
I've seen over the years people that their adrenal glands, what's the word I'm looking for? They're in that stress, that cell stress response. Right? Your adrenals need salt to function appropriately. And so people, when they'll have a decreased adrenal response, they'll crave salt. And
but how does, is this salt, the lack of salt then is causing that's causing them to crave carbohydrates?
Possibly. Or
no, what do you think? Is it, you think they're mixing up salt need for blood glucose need, or are you saying that the salt need is creating a problem with cortisol production? Is it too much, too little? What's creating that? What do you think is creating that craving?
Both of those things that you just said could be a factor. It could be a neurotransmitter factor. It might be that they're not making enough neurotransmitters, so they're getting into these addictive pathways, and that's creating sugar, cravings. And it could just be some metabolic dysfunction that I don't understand or you don't understand that's just causing them to need glucose every couple of hours.
Yeah, I guess the answer I would give for that is that if a person has this cell stress response going on due to toxicity or infection or dysbiosis or something along those lines, or they have they're in a chronic stress response due to trauma, thoughts, emotions, and they've wound up this thing in your brain called the limbic system.
Yep.
We're in this kind of fight or flight response. In that situation, the body needs energy. Now,
and you couple that with a candida overgrowth.
well, that's another, yeah. So that's another layer of stuff. But let's hold that thought for a second. But if you're in a cell stress response, your body needs energy and it needs it quickly, right? And so, what are you going to use under more intense stress? You've got two fuel sources for the listener. You've got glucose as a primary fuel source, and you can use fats as a primary fuel source. Glucose is easier, faster, quicker to burn and get energy from.
Yep.
Fats requires more energy, more time, and we typically use that energy. We can either make energy from glucose and fats either aerobically. And typically we think about inside these engines inside the cell called the mitochondria, or we can make energy anaerobically, essentially with less oxygen. And the most efficient way to do that, quick, easy, with less oxygen, is making glucose or using glucose. Fats require a lot of energy. It takes time. Even running through the mitochondria takes more time. So when you're in a chronic stress response, for whatever reason, the brain and the body is going to want to utilize glucose as its primary fuel source, and it's going to want to make it quick and fast, and that is going to be glucose, probably anaerobically. And the same cell stress response that Brady and I have been talking about is likely going to downregulate your mitochondria anyway. So you're going to be driving on glucose production. The problem is you get it there's a limited amount that you can get in the cell and use at one period of time. So you've got this volume, everything else goes into fat storage, and now you need glucose. And so now the body's going to be like, I need glucose again. Well, why wouldn't you pull it out of fat storage and use it? Well, to break down that fats requires energy, requires time, and requires healthy mitochondrial function and thyroid function. Well, I'm in cell stress. I don't have that going on. So I need more quick, immediate energy. So you're putting stuff in, you can only use a limited amount. It's starting to push into fat cells, into fat storage. And in a very short period of time, those tissues are saying, I need more. And you can say, well, I just ate. Right. But your brain is like, I'm through what you ate. We either used it or stored it. And the body doesn't have the physiology to really pull that out of, when you're in that cell stress response, it's not pulling that stuff out of storage. It's going to use what's available, quick, dirty, easy.
I have a anecdotal, beautiful story about this exact thing that you're talking about. It's my wife. Mm-hmm. Okay, so when I first met Kim, we've been married 7 years now. I met her at the gym, and she's always been small. Like, she's tiny. And when I met her, she was having headaches, stressed out, couldn't go very long without eating. She even had some edema issues where her kids would say that she got her elephant legs, where her ankles would disappear because of edema. Mm-hmm. And she could not go more than 2 hours without eating something, with the exception of sleeping. Okay? So when I met her, I said, I was like, hey, I could probably help you with some of this stuff. She's like, yeah, whatever, you're a chiropractor, you can't help me. Mm-hmm. So I offered a challenge to her. I'm like, look, here's my, here's a 2-week program. Why don't you try this? So the 2-week program involved getting off of processed foods and getting onto a whole food diet and eliminating gluten, soy, dairy, all of the, I hate the saying all of the things, but all of the things. You fast forward to 7 years later, and she just completed just last week a 72-hour fast and was fine, no headache. So what I'm getting at there, Eric, is I think you hit it right on the head. We've decreased her cellular stress response by eliminating toxic foods. We live a pretty healthy, natural lifestyle. She's saunas constantly, all these things to get rid of these toxins, and now her cells are healthy and strong and happy, and she can go long periods of time without eating. So
yeah, and I would totally agree. I think part of what in that situation, as you kind of make some of those modifications, reduce whatever the cell stress, and I always say there's a load. It's not the thing, it's the load, right? There's a bunch of stuff that contributes to it, but you're doing a lot of the foundational things right. Less toxicity from the food. That means there's less inflammatory triggers, less glucose resistance, and mitochondrial function can increase. And one of the things that may have been going on, especially if she was exercising during that time frame, she's still exercising, which sounds great. But if you're exercising and emptying those stores out and you can't burn fats as a fuel efficiently, you might actually be making the glucose cravings actually worse, right? And so in an effort to exercise harder to lose weight, you're pushing yourself into a state where your body actually craves more carbs. You start keeping the muffin top, right? Because hey, I crave because I overdid the training for what my physiology's at, and I take more carbs than I can utilize, and now they got to go somewhere. And typically it's the muffin top that almost every female who's athletics starts to develop as they overtrain. They think they have the worst trainer in the world, and really what they are doing is probably overtraining, poor recovery, and they're creating that overtraining is probably creating their stress response. The other thing I want to touch base on is the cortisol piece, and this is really important for the thyroid patient and
the weight loss patient.
And the weight loss patient is keep in mind that acutely, the adrenal gland has the ability to make cholesterol, which then can be converted into cortisol inside the adrenal gland acutely. But on a regular basis and chronically and on a regular basis, most of the cortisol that's generated at the adrenal gland is not made inside the adrenal gland. The cholesterol comes from the bloodstream. HDL docks to the adrenal gland, dumps off cholesterol. That receptor requires appropriate levels of T3. Then that cholesterol gets into the adrenal gland. It can get to the mitochondria, and then that cholesterol can be converted into pregnenolone, but it requires a state of T3 inside the cell that wouldn't be there if there's a chronic cell stress response. So why I'm pushing all this stuff, because I hear people talking, I'm not giving you a hard time, Brady, but I hear people talk about adrenal fatigue as an issue. Adrenal fatigue is not a real issue. The gland does not fatigue. But when we have chronic stress, chronic inflammatory issues, chronic toxicity, that inflammatory process decreases the conversion of T4 to T3 at various tissues. It reduces the internal state. And it is that low T3 state at the adrenal gland, my opinion, that then results in lower cortisol as we measure it throughout the day. The morning version, if you did blood cortisol in the morning on almost anybody you thought had adrenal fatigue, they'd have appropriate blood levels of cortisol. Why? It's my opinion that part of that cortisol awakening response, that cortisol is generated from cholesterol inside the cell. But when we look at it throughout the rest of the day, for some of these people, the reason they don't get as much to the tissues, part of that is they don't have healthy cellular physiology at the adrenal gland to get the cholesterol out of the bloodstream into the adrenal gland to make it. So I don't think we fix the physiology by trying to manipulate the adrenal gland per se. There's things we can do to adaptogens can be helpful, but I often hear people say, hey, the adrenal issue. I think the adrenal issue is a bigger part of the whole immune inflammatory issue. And the other thing I would say is if we take in glucose that we can't use and it gets into the cell and the mitochondria can't use it efficiently, the Krebs cycle and mitochondria can't turn that into cellular energy, that glucose comes back out of the cell as, guess what? Cholesterol. Why does the body do that? Is it because cholesterol is bad? No, because then that cholesterol can go to the adrenal gland and make hormones. It can go to cell membranes and make stuff, right? We can push it into the liver to get rid of it and make bile. So I think that piece plays a huge role in what's going on when we say, hey, we've got adrenal fatigue, because part of the adrenal gland's job is to make cortisol, and part of cortisol's job is to help regulate glucose, make more glucose in times of chronic stress, right? Or acute stress, I should say. Do you agree with those thoughts?
You've taken me to school, Eric.
So we've got the dietary thing. We talked about intermittent fasting. I think do you see, and I know you don't, maybe you're not doing as much of the lab work perspective, maybe that I do, but you have almost, I would argue that every patient you have coming in there with a weight issue, a blood glucose issue, has a tissue thyroid issue. They have a reduced conversion of T4 to T3. They have a thyroid issue. May not have a gland issue. They may not need thyroid hormone replacement, but they have reduced metabolism. And I always say it's more adaptive than broken. So do you really see, if you're looking at any labs, that the person who has a diagnosed thyroid condition, that them doing intermittent fasting is problematic?
I haven't seen it yet, but I'm going to start looking for it.
So I think it goes back to what you said before. It's individually based, but the reason I see it problematic for a lot of these people is because their level of T3 is so compromised at the cell level that when they do intermittent fasting, they don't have a great ability to burn fats as a fuel. And so they have to kind of ease into that process. If they go hard, right, they may really crash and need it because they're now liberating fats. And if they're liberating those fats and they have a low free T3 to free T4 ratio, they're probably not going to be able to burn those things effectively. And maybe the clue for us as the clinicians and maybe for the client is if their triglycerides are already elevated and their VLDL is already elevated, this is a person who's struggling already with utilizing fats as a fuel. Do you see that?
I haven't looked for it, but it's definitely something that you've taught me a clinical pearl here. It's something I'm going to start doing with the people that don't respond as quickly as we want them to.
So I think that's a big key for us. And that doesn't mean if you're hypothyroid that you can't do what Brady's saying. Hey, let's do whole food based diet. Let's try to get some intermittent fasting started and see how you tolerate it. But even though we might say 6 hours, 8 hours, 10 hours, 14 hours, 18 hours, people talk about days of doing it, you're not probably going to start there. It would be like saying, hey, let's go run a marathon right now, even though you haven't trained. You're probably not going to do well. You're probably going to have more health issues as a result of not training. Intermittent fasting and getting to a point of intermittent fasting, you got to get there slowly, steadily, many times so that it doesn't create a bigger issue. Would you agree with that?
Totally.
And so if we got whole food based diet, we're now going to say one of the things you can do is start to incrementally spread those the meal planning out so that you can try and see if your body can start slowly try to integrate more fat burning and fat metabolism. But let's talk about calories and macros. At what point do we start talking to somebody? Okay, we got you doing intermittent fasting. We got you eating whole food. At what point do we really talk about what calories need to be or should be and what macros could be or should be?
So the basic guideline that I go off of is protein. Hey, how much protein does one need to eat? And based off of ideal body weight, it's about a gram per pound of your ideal body weight. Not what your body weight is now, but your ideal body weight. So if your ideal body weight, you know, you and I are about the same size height wise. But to me, my ideal body weight's about 190 pounds. That's my fighting weight. That's when I have muscle, decreased fat. So 190 grams of protein is my goal. And then for the rest of the macros, I just try to put in where I fill in the gaps with the rest of the macros, right? Because when we're talking about macros, we're talking about proteins, we're talking about fats, we're talking about carbs. And carbs is not a swear word. Okay? It's not a bad thing. Refined carbs are, but when I fill my plate, it's going to be heavy on protein, whatever else I can fit in and not feel bloated. You have to slow down when you eat so you know when those hunger signals hit. Okay. Yeah. But I work out a lot. So I'm a little bit more, and I eat cleaner than most. So it's like I'm a little more metabolically healthy than most. So when my patients come to me and we get them to their ideal body weight, and then they start exercising more, that's when we start adjusting. I don't ever have the calorie conversation with them. It's like, oh, you're going to increase your, excuse me, you're going to increase your exercise load this week. Okay, let's increase your protein. Oh, you're feeling run down. Okay, let's increase your carbs. Have more fruit.
Yeah. So for the listener, I agree with, protein should be the foundation of what we start to think about when we think about macros.
And when you get quality protein, you're picking up quality fat too.
Yeah, because most of the stuff, and this not necessarily powders and stuff that we're buying off at Walmart or Kmart or something like that, that to get that in for the most part. I think for the most part, what I want people to make sure is, hey, we need to get you, and I'll use it in a range, and I think you kind of hinted towards this. If I kind of look at somewhere between maybe 0.7 to 1.0 grams of protein per pound of ideal body weight based on somebody's activity level, right? So ultimately, if they're sedentary, I still want them to be protein heavy, but they may not be able to get and utilize that protein efficiently. So I definitely think that the goal should be somewhere close to that 1 gram of protein per pound of ideal body weight, because they should be physically active. So they should be getting physical activity and strength training and those things as part of their foundation. So for the listener, I think the easy calculation, if you think about what Brady's saying here, is if you look at if you're going to look at your macro percentages, that gram of protein per pound of body weight, roughly about 40% of your caloric intake is going to be somewhere around protein. And that's the balance, kind of the foundational piece. So Ray, tell them why that protein piece is so important to have. Because so many people are like, well, I don't like to eat a lot of protein. I don't like to eat that. Why is protein so important?
Every single tissue in your body is made up of protein. Every metabolic chemical reaction that happens because you have enzymes. Enzymes are made up of amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins.
Yeah.
Like I'm sitting here talking to you, Eric, looking at you, your eyes are moving back and forth. Those eye muscles are based off of proteins.
Yeah.
Like we are a protein being. Yes, you have to have a variety of fiber to support your microbiota. We know that. But you've got to have protein so all that microbiota has a body to do something with.
Yeah. Yeah. So for the listeners, I think the thing that keep it so simple, Brady's extremely on point with his explanation. But The basic building block of everything in the body is the amino acids that come from your protein intake. They turn into everything that, if you want to build something, these are like the 2x4s that you're building things with. You cannot build anything without the structural material. When you think about carbs and fats, carbs are an energy source. Fats are a blend. They're part energy, part building block.
Yeah.
So when we look at these things, we need to make sure that we have the building blocks. If we want to get healthy, if we want to build muscle, if we want to repair, if I want to have a healthy cell membrane, I have to have sufficient amount of the building blocks. And that comes down to proteins, because we break those down into amino acids, and we need the fats that often come with those proteins, as Brady said, because those are the building blocks of our cell membranes, of our bile acids, of all these, of our neurotransmitters, of our hormones. They're also a building block. Carbs are really an energy source. We can use fats, we can use carbs, we can even break down proteins to make into energy sources. So the foundation should really be proteins, fats, and then carbohydrates.
Amen.
But a good blend of those things becomes really important. So I typically, as somebody gave me a rough number, I would go like, hey, 40% protein, 30% carbs, 30% fats, and then go tinker from there with carbs and fats. Like, where do I feel better? Right. And then I also look at somebody's labs, and especially their free T3 to free T4 ratio, and make calculations of whether they're going to do better on carbs or higher carb, higher fat based on that ratio. So if I know that they have a lower ratio, then I may skew them more towards carbs than fats. Why? Because I know they don't have great cellular metabolism. So they're going to probably feel crappier. So I want to kind of slowly inch them along versus just saying, hey, we're going to just give you fats. And this is where people like, I feel like dirt because nothing's working. Well, because they're not efficient at converting fats into ketones and using those things. They're not efficient at converting those fats into energy. And so they can feel lousy. So I kind of look at it that way. So calories in, calories out. I totally get what you're looking at. It's like, I'm less about that. I want them to eat a whole food-based diet, heavy on protein, and then figure out carbs and fats as we go. If you're, man, I'm a little exhausted from doing that. Hey, you probably need more carbohydrates to help with that easy, fast fuel. But once we start really getting there, we can become really more fat adapted where, hey, if I don't have something to eat, my body's going to break down those fats and utilize it. What do you tell people that say, well, I need to eat the carbs so I feel good, but I can't, but I'm also not losing fat? Why would reducing carbohydrates be so important to losing fat in the long run?
I think it just depends on the carbohydrate. You know, it's like the old saying, when you eat, the only thing you should feel is full. Unfortunately, we do have people that get addicted to these simple carbohydrates, and so they present with abnormal brain chemistry. So it's like, okay, well, I have to have that carb. And I hate to sound like cold about it, but I'm like, do you? Or is your neurochemistry just a little goofy?
Well, for a lot of people, their neurochemistry is off, right? So if somebody's overweight and obese, and I think the literature says if they're leptin, which is a marker of, for the listener, when you start storing calories in your fat cells, your fat cell then releases leptin that goes to the brain and says, hey, stop eating, we're good.
Right.
But once you get to a level of leptin about 20, your brain becomes leptin resistant. So just like you can become glucose resistant, you can become leptin resistant.
Right.
And now, even though you just had a piece of, pizza and a Big Mac, your brain is going, I'm still hungry.
Yeah.
And that's why these people get to 600 pounds and you're like, don't they realize they just ate 3 pizzas and they're telling me they're still hungry? Right. Because their brain is getting that signal that they are still hungry. Right.
Absolutely.
So we talked about calories, macros, healthy whole food. What about exercise, and where do you see the role of exercise in helping people improve
Oh
their
gosh.
health, their well-being, um, and regulating blood glucose and getting to a healthier weight?
Um, Exercise or die. It's literally come to that. Let me rephrase that. Start exercising now or die early. It is absolutely critical that you move. Okay. And what I tell people is we got to start wherever you're at. Right. So if you start my program and you're already exercising 6 times a week, awesome. We're just going to give you more food. If you're starting my program and you don't get off the couch, then you're walking 15 minutes twice a day. We're starting there. But exercise is not about burning calories. It's about brain health and it's about sugar regulation, in my opinion. Like when we exercise, what are we doing to our joints? We are moving our joints. Our brain needs two things to survive. It needs fuel, it needs activation. You know, everyone thinks you need to play Sudoku to save grandma's brain. But the reality is what you need is movement of those large joints because they're associated with what's called the large diameter afferent system in the back part of your spinal cord that provides 80% of the input to your brain. You've got to move your joints to fire your brain to get your brain working at the level that it should. So glucose metabolism, we hinted on it earlier, when you move your body actually builds more insulin receptors and it takes glucose in faster. So exercising, having a strong exercise routine is going to help you have a robust glucose system that helps take glucose up much more efficiently. You're not going to have all the excess glucose hanging out in your system to get converted into fat or hooked to red blood cells. You've got to move. And it's like so here's a big question I get. Okay, most people go on they're in my program for 4 months. And they say, well, what about after that 4 months? Well, that's when we start talking about the 80-20-90-10 or 90-10 rule. I tell them, look, if you live the way we teach you 90% of the time and save that 10% of the time, which is less than one meal a week, by the way, to eat whatever, a piece of cake or whatever, you're probably going to be fine. Unless you have some screaming gluten sensitivity, which, we can test for. If you get a strong exercise routine, your body can actually afford to have a few more of those standard American foods here and there, because you're going to develop a flexible metabolic system so you can recover quicker metabolically. So that's the role I think exercise plays in it.
Yeah, I think, because you hear people say, well, I'm too tired to exercise. I don't feel good enough to exercise. And then
start where you are.
People say a lot of times, well, I do exercise. And I think we have to start to look at and kind of have a better understanding of what exercise is. I really prefer the term training. I'm training my body for life, right? Versus I'm just exercising. And the other thing we have to decide is, do I have an exercise behavior or do I have an exercise or training habit? Okay. Does it have a goal? What am I trying to achieve? Am I tracking? What am I doing? Am I getting stronger? Am I getting more stable? I think you need to have a training habit, like you have breathing habit, like you have an eating habit, like you have a sleeping habit, right? This is not, it's not necessarily negotiable if you want to be healthy, if you don't want to be on drugs, if you don't want to have, chronic health issues. You have to train your body every day. Now, how much do you train? What does that look like? That depends on what your goals are. If you want to run marathons, you have to train a certain way. If you want to be a CrossFitter, you have to train a certain way. If you want to do mountain biking, you have to train a certain way. If you want general health and general well-being, you need to train a certain way, right? And so when people ask me, and I say, hey, let's talk about your physical fitness. Well, do you exercise or train regularly? Well, if they start out with or then I already know the answer, or I try to, versus, and I'm not beating people up with that. And we don't want to get caught up in like, well, you need to eat less and exercise more, that it's that simple. But it doesn't mean you get to not do something that's going to promote health because somebody is saying that you don't exercise enough. Many people exercise but don't train. And what I mean by that is I walked a little bit, and then I took my 2-pound weights and I did this like a bunch of times, and I did this a bunch of times. And yeah. And did you feel anything? No. So they feel like they're doing something periodically, but I don't think I think it has to be a habit. And what I mean by that is it's not a negotiable thing, right? In your mind, you may be fighting it, but you get up at 5:30 in the morning, and where you go to your gym. Like in my house, my gym's in my basement. So you get up and you just go do it. I don't think I really ever think about it, other than sometimes I'm like, man, maybe I could do something else. But then I walk downstairs and I feel better after I've done it.
Right.
But you said people should start where they are, but what are your foundational concepts that people should be considering when they're going to develop an exercise habit, a training habit for life? What are the things that they need to consider? Cardio, strength training, yoga, like what do you tell people they need to consider for general health?
I literally just tell them to find what they enjoy. We live in such an area that hiking is a big deal here. Get outside, like go move, like just hike. So, but I literally, like I said, I tell them to do what they enjoy. But one case that I can think of is a gal that came to me, and she was in her 20s, and she wanted to lose like 60 pounds because she wanted to get healthy before she had a baby. Okay? And she did it. She shed the weight. And then she comes to me and she says, well, the weight's gone. Now what? I'm like, well, you're 20 something. It's now time to get ripped. Right? Muscle's the organ of longevity. And so I sent her over to a CrossFit gym, and all of a sudden she's on podiums. I'm like, that's awesome. Okay. Fun story. She's now pregnant with twins, which is awesome. So that's one case, right? So if you're in your 20s, 30s, or I'm in my 40s, you've got to get as much muscle healthy muscle as you can, because that's going to pay off dividends for you in your 50s, 60s, and 70s. Versus one case I can think of, I had an 86-year-old woman come to me that just wanted to lose 25 pounds. And Eric, I literally looked this woman in the eye and I said, you're 86 years old. Why the hell do you want to lose 26 pounds? And she looks at me and she defiantly puts her hands on my hips and on her hips, and she goes, well, because I want to be sexy. Mm-hmm. It made me laugh. But for her fitness level, she wants to just be able to go up and down her stairs, work in her garden, and not feel tired. So for her, something more aerobically challenging is going to be better versus someone who's in their 20s. Like let's get a muscle foundation. So I think the answer is different depending on where people are at.
Yeah, I think you have to train for certain things, but I would say, and remind me to come back to that, she wanted to lose 26 pounds. But for what I want my patients to keep in mind is you should have a couple key things as part of what you're doing for your physical fitness and well-being.
That's awesome.
Slow cardio, right? Every day you should be doing some form of slow cardio. And that means just going for a walk. Brady was talking about after meals, go for a 15-minute walk, right? We use this kind of number of 10,000 or 12,000 steps per day as a metric. How valid is it? I don't know, but it's better than zero, right?
Right.
So if you have a goal of getting 10,000 steps per day, that's great. That's usually slow cardio. I'm going to go for a walk. I'm going to go at lunch. I'm going to do a lap around the neighborhood, or I'm going to go after dinner. I'm going to go out with my wife and go for a walk. That's slow cardio. Everybody should be doing it. And whether that's, if that's a hike for you, like, hey, doing mountains, great. Now you're getting slow cardio and you're getting strength training because you're doing a lot of climbing with those things up and down. I think second piece that everybody needs to consider, and Brady was talking about this, is you got to build lean muscle mass. How do you do it? You got to do weight-based training. I can't tell you how many people are like, I have decreased bone density, I need to take more calcium. No, you don't need to take more calcium. You don't need more vitamin D. What you need to do is you need to get outside and you need to do strength training and you need to reduce your inflammation. The biggest driver of bone loss is chronic low-grade inflammation. And the biggest lie, and you may disagree with me, but the biggest lie in healthcare is that excessive amounts of vitamin D is protective. It is not. If people really understood what vitamin D physiology, vitamin D does not increase bone density. Vitamin D's one job is to increase blood calcium, not bone calcium, blood calcium. So when you have low calcium in the blood, that triggers physiology to convert 25 vitamin D to 125 vitamin D to pull calcium out of the gut and pull it out of your bone. That's what its role is. It's normalized blood calcium, not bone calcium. So we have a $4 billion industry in the vitamin D world. And I think it's a joke. Just a little side effect, Brady. You probably didn't see this paper, but they wanted to know what would happen if they knocked out the vitamin D receptors on the fat cells of rats. And so they wondered, because there's this discussion, why do people who are overweight and obese have low 25 OHD? They thought maybe it would just go into storage. And the thought process was they just overweight people need more vitamin D. And the reality is that what the science seems to show is that when vitamin D gets to the fat cells, it doesn't just get stored there. It converts to 125 vitamin D to act as an anti-inflammatory. And number two, to make the fat cells, and there's an argument here, either bigger so you can store more calories or more fat cells. So what they did was to say, if that's true, what happens if we knock out the vitamin D receptors on rat adipose tissue and kept feeding them excessive calories? Guess what happens? It can't get fat.
Whoa.
So in our effort to provide a steroid-like effect with vitamin D to suppress the immune system and potentially say everybody's deficient, are we potentially, by giving people excessive amounts of vitamin D, increasing the obesity epidemic? Food for thought. Just take that with you and think about that later. But when we think about what vitamin D does, it can reduce the immune response. It's anti-inflammatory, but it really is a steroid-like effect. Short-term may be beneficial. I have real concerns that we're taking way too much vitamin D. If you think about it, what foods are rich in vitamin D?
Fish.
Cold water fish, where there's less sun exposure. If we were meant to get most of our vitamin D from supplements, from foods, don't you think the big guy would have made most of the foods in the tropical regions and the more temperate regions of the world rich in vitamin D? Or do you think it was just a mistake? I don't know. Things to think about. But anytime that everybody is deficient in something, that leads me to think we're not interpreting it right. Right? So the other thing I want you to talk about too is, we talked about weight. You had your patient come in and said, hey, I want to lose 26 pounds. And we have a problem in this country with the weight, losing weight and the weight number, right?
Totally.
And we think that I need to be this weight to be healthy because of these charts and stuff. But while the number is important, it's not the end all be all, right?
No.
Because you could be 165 pounds, or you could be 190 pounds, or you could be 210 pounds. but you could be healthy potentially at the heavier weight than the lighter weight, right?
That 100%.
So when a person comes into you and says, I want to lose 26 pounds and they're overweight, do you say, yes, we're going to be focused on getting 26 pounds down? Or do you say, listen, our goal shouldn't be the weight number. It should be how you wear the weight, right?
Yeah.
Because if you are 185, I'm 185. If I'm 185 and I have muscle, I can look fantastic. And I could be 185 with limited muscle and not look fantastic. So the number, we get too caught up. Would you say, how do you have that conversation with your clients that come in about the weight number? Because everybody wants to lose weight, right? But you got to get healthy to lose weight. But how do we make a decision? How do you work with them on that number? Like, I know you want to lose 26 pounds, but let's talk about what that is going to mean and what it looks like.
Right. So I'm a little bit more of a Neanderthal than you are. Like I try to keep things like, I try to keep it as simple as I can for them. So I'm actually okay with them using weight as a goal, but not their primary goal. Okay, so we have them take measurements, right? Because you can lose fat, you can lose inches and not lose any weight. So we have them measure inches, but we also tell them pay attention to how you feel. And because when the reality is when you go on an anti-inflammatory diet, your joints are going to stop hurting. Mental clarity is going to go through the roof. You're going to start sleeping better. You're going to start just having more and more energy. So we need to pay attention to those things. Are there ways to measure those objectively? No, but just pay attention. Because as you start to feel better and you look at people's graphs, we use technology to, we have an app with a scale that'll link to it. So we have patients all over the country that we work with. You can see their their graph going down segmentally. It'll go up one day and then down one day, up one day, and it never looks like a straight line. And they get all frustrated and pissed off when it's, you're up 2 pounds today. I'm like, but look at the graph overall, and then look at how you feel. Hey, your clothes are fitting better. You're out in the garden more. So that's the gist of the conversation that I have.
Yeah, I mean, I always ask a patient, like, what do you think your optimal weight is? Just so they have an idea point, because we are thinking about, hey, what are our calories, protein, macros? What should they look like? Because I think a lot of people look at their current weight and say, okay, I got to eat for a 185-pound person. Well, wait a sec. You said your optimal weight would probably be closer to 150 pounds. So you shouldn't be eating the calories and the macros of a 185 pounder. You should be eating the calories and the macros of a 150-pound person. So that part becomes important. But I think we do need to continue to have that conversation with people and look at other metrics. And blood work is a great metric. HRV is a great metric. Waist and hip measurements, cheap, and everybody can do those things at home. They don't even need any technology. If your pulse rate goes down, if your respiration rate is going down, if your waist and hip ratios are going down, then the weight number may not matter as much, especially if you are doing that consistent training, right? So that becomes an important thing. When people get stuck on a number in their head, I was 120 in high school, so I should be 120 again. I don't know if that's realistic. Do you have the same muscle mass do you have more or less muscle mass than you did when you were in high school? I don't know. Okay. Well, that's important, because if you're carrying more lean muscle than you were when you were in high school, that 120 is not probably realistic unless you're going to lose a bunch of muscle mass as well. I mean, I wrestled 126 in college. I'm nowhere close to that now, but I feel and function better, at a higher weight, and I can fluctuate. I don't get overly concerned about weight, because it depends on how much training and what type of training you're doing, right?
I'm literally 40 pounds heavier than when I graduated high school. But myself now would absolutely destroy my 18-year-old self in strength, in and endurance. Like it's just no comparison.
Right. It and ultimately we are in a competition with age and gravity.
Right. Right.
Right. So
Yep.
we need that. We need to be constantly developing lean muscle and working on maintaining our lean muscle, because for the most of us are in an we're in a battle losing muscle mass in time. And yet what we do is we're losing muscle, the thing that burns calories, helps us burn calories most effectively. And yet we're still consuming the same amount of calories and maybe more. And
Yeah.
then we wonder why we're adding more body fat. Hey, we're consuming more as we age, as our muscle density goes down, our caloric needs, even though we're the same weight, probably goes down a bit.
Yeah. Yep.
So we talked about the foundation, good whole food based diet. We talked about a little bit about calories, macros. We talked about intermittent fasting. What are the other factors when somebody's got weight issues, blood sugar regulation issues? What are the other foundational things that you talk to your clients about uh, in your program that can contribute to blood glucose dysregulation and ultimately increase body fat?
I think we've actually hit on almost all the factors that I can think of off the top of my head.
So I would say maybe the one we didn't talk about, and probably a good one to discuss, and we maybe hinted on it, but do you talk to them a lot at all about what goes on between the 6 inches of their ears? Like emotionally, how does real or perceived stress from their environment impact blood glucose regulation potentially and fat storage?
Well, you talked about the four other factors that you can actually get glucose from your own body, which is a process called gluconeogenesis. And one of the things that happens is when you're under that chronic stress, like when you know when something happens to you and you overreact to it, you dump out all this cortisol. That cortisol is actually going to take glycogen out of your muscles and make glucose out of it. So if you've already got excess glucose, plus you're stressed, I keep hitting my microphone. I hope that doesn't change my audio. Plus you're stressed, plus you're eating, your comfort foods because you're stressed. There's just a cascade of problems there.
Yeah. So stress, whether it's real or perceived, causes the release of hormones and and chemicals that can raise blood glucose. We talked about eating glucose raises glucose, but we also have glucagon. And I'm going to talk to you in a second here about some of the new drugs that are out there that are the kind of the craze. But glucagon is a hormone that tells the liver to keep making glucose so that in a fasted state, the body can make some glucose. Brady said gluconeogenesis. We also have cortisol, which is, hey, stress, bam, let me make some glucose real quickly. And then we also have catecholamines, epinephrine, norepinephrine, that these things under stress, I think this is where, and this is my tie, Brady. I mean, you're a smart guy too, but here's my thought process too when we think about what's going on. If I'm in chronic stress, these catecholamines drive glucose production, right?
Mm-hmm.
Their backbone is tyrosine. If I'm under chronic cell stress, there's a natural down regulation of cell metabolism. Thyroid hormone's backbone, tyrosine. So if I'm in chronic stress mode, now I put tyrosine into the body and the cells and the tissues get to make the decision, where do these building blocks get shuttled, right? Just like you say, hey, we're going to eat glucose. I want it to go to my muscle. Well, your muscle doesn't maybe get to make that decision, right? The inflammatory signals in the immune system says, no, that's going into fat storage, right?
Yep.
But I think what happens a lot of that may be a factor, and I don't have the science on it. I just call it tyrosine steal is my hypothesis, that people who have chronic immune and chronic inflammatory processes going on The cells are naturally down regulating metabolism. I think the same mechanisms drive the thyroiditis. And then if I don't need all that tyrosine because I'm down regulating the metabolism, I can shift more tyrosine to support these catecholamines that then can help generate more glucose production. So just my thought. So the other thing, we have something called growth hormone that can drive it too. So we have a lot of mechanisms to raise glucose in the system. So if we're stressed, whether it's real or perceived, right? And everybody says, well, I have so much stress. Like, we all have stress. Like, everybody's got a story to tell. So, I don't like to be negative. Like, every time somebody says, but my life is so stressful. Listen, I can bring 10 people and they'll tell you a worse story than yours. So it's really not about the stress in the environment, it's how we perceive it. And it's how it perseverates in our brain that either winds up that limbic system and creates more stress hormones being generated, more glucose being generated, or we're really good with what goes on with the brain and we can calm that noise down. I think one of the best things that happened to me was a number of years ago taking up archery hunting, because I didn't realize the noise that went on inside my brain until I tried to sit in a tree stand for like 8 hours a day. And then you're like, all of that noise for you, it may be fly fishing, right? Quiet, you're alone with yourself, you're not listening to music, right? You're just quiet with your own thoughts and actions. And I would sit in that stand and be like, I got stuff to do. I got this and that and all this. And I started to realize how much noise was going on in my brain on a constant basis. And I was doing probably a whole bunch of other things, so I didn't have to listen to that. And when I started archery hunting, man, you got to be able to sit for a long period of time. And all of that stuff floods in. And it really helped me. I'm not the guy who's going to sit in the middle of the floor and chant and hum and, do meditation that way. But that became my way of meditating to calm that outside noise. And I say this for the people that are listening to this podcast, is that if you have a lot of real or perceived stress that's impacting you, right? Hey, I've got a bad relationship. I hate my job. If your self-talk is bad, if what's coming in is all getting interpreted as danger or fear, you should expect that you're going to have a glucose regulation issue. You should expect you're going to have a thyroid related issue. You should expect you're going to have a body fat storage issue. Would you agree with that?
That's 100%.
So, I mean, that's where I was kind of going with that with you and your clients. Like, do you guys have that? Do you get into that level of intimacy? Like, hey, especially for the person who says, hey, Brady, I'm eating well. I'm exercising. This isn't working. At what point do you look at it and go, all right, Jane, tell me what else is going on in your life?
Yeah, it is something that our coaches are trained to do. One of my favorite things is box breathing. You can literally do it anytime, anywhere. YouTube is full of guided meditations. I'm with you. I'm not going to be the guy sitting legs crossed with, in the middle of the floor humming. But there's just so many ways of just mediating that, and they're simple, they're free. But we do teach those often.
And I think it's huge because people spend so much time trying to do a bunch of things to get healthy, to exercise, to eat right. And it's those people that continue to have those issues. And once you start to meet some of those people, you already know who they are when they're walking in the door, that, hey, this person has a lot of real baggage, a lot of limbic windup. And we got to get there aware that the issue may not be as much external
as
internal driven. And I think that's a huge piece in the chronic immune inflammatory processes that we see, the blood glucose regulation issues, people, and they don't even know that they're not happy, that they're anxious, that they're irritable, because they're like, this is how it is every Tuesday. I mean, this is just Tuesday.
You turn the TV on and what is it? What do you see? Nothing but medications for those things. So they must be normal, right? No, that's normal. That is a sign of dysfunction.
Yeah. So I think it's important that we have this conversation, because these are big topics we talk about in TV and healthcare and everything else. And everybody's got blood sugars problem. Everybody's overweight or obese. You just need to exercise more and eat less. yes, those things are important, but you need to eat quality food. You need to train every day.
Yep.
And then if you do those foundational things and you're still struggling, then you look at the other pieces. We call them the fitness factors. I'm sure with your clients, you have the same things that you talk about that, hey, these are foundational, right? These are not like negotiative things where you can say, okay, but I still want to eat crappy. And I agree with you. We have to be careful. We want to do the right things to get to a point of health and well-being. But if for a lot of people trying to be perfect, I want to have the perfect workout, the perfect routine, the perfect diet. I'm never going to do anything. I think for a lot of those people, that is a massive stress in your life. Do you see that as well?
100% I do.
So I want to wrap this up. We've got a couple minutes left. Tell people like what you're doing. You talked about a couple courses that you have. So talk
Yeah.
about the courses. What are they? Who are they geared towards, and where can they find more about them?
So, my goal with these courses is to provide entry level information, right? Because unfortunately, we've gotten to a point where we have far too long let doctors make our health decisions almost in an attitude of like, I'm just going to eat whatever, the package says this is healthy, I'm just going to eat this, and then if I get sick, I'll go take a medication.
Mhm.
And I want to break that thinking. And so what I've done is I've created some courses that are just basic fundamental, like, here, make these changes, learn this information, because this isn't just going to affect you and give you a better quality of life, but it's also your children are going to see you do this, and it's going to affect them in a positive outcome. So for generations to come, we've got to get away from eating processed foods with packages that say they're healthy and get towards eating more whole foods for our overall optimal health and well-being. So
these are introductory courses. Anybody can go get them.
Yes. And I've tried to keep them as affordable as I can. We're talking like a $21 price tag. I did not want to make this big, expensive. Like, no, this is it. I put a lot of work into them. I feel like I'm giving them away. But if you follow these things, your overall health will improve drastically.
Yeah. And so we can kind of cut through the noise of which whole food based diet. This is just giving you the instructions of this is what a whole food based paleo-ish type diet looks like.
Yes,
this is how you
yes.
do it. These are the things you may have some struggles with along the way as you make the transition. This is how you meal plan, meal prep, shop, things to look at. So you can just have the real foundational pieces, right?
So let me just give you what you get with the blood sugar course. Okay. I have already loaded in here. There's a 1-month meal plan. I've got an ebook about the ultimate guide to weight loss that I've written. I have an inflammation questionnaire. So if you answer, when you start the process, fill out this questionnaire and put it away. Then when you end the process, answer the questions again and then compare the two, and you'll be blown away at the results that you've seen. There's a list here of 50 low glycemic foods, a list of 50 low glycemic vegetables. Plus, we've put in access. We do have a private Facebook group that we run. On top, and this is on top of the course. The course itself is you'll get emailed every day for 14 days, or excuse me, for 21 days. Bits of information like you and I have talked about. Like, you and I have pretty much just followed the course down through all the topics that we cover, but we do it in little bite-sized nuggets that are easily understandable and applicable. So there's a lot of stuff there that I think if people start putting those things into gear, we can make a massive, massive change in our, not just our personal healthcare, but in all of healthcare around. If we get enough people doing this, we're all going to be in a much, much better place.
Yeah. And so where can they go to find the information and content and more information about you? I know I have the links to stuff, but where can they go?
So I'm very active on social media. But if you just Google my name, Dr. Brady Wirick, you'll find my website. My website's Intermountain Center for Wellbeing. I don't know what I was thinking when I chose that URL. I need to fix that. Even Dr. Brady Wirick is, that's hard to spell on a mouthful. So if you go to my social media feeds, and Wirick is spelled Wirick, you'll find me there. You can go to my website. But as far as the courses are concerned, I do talk about them. I do have posts about them. But if you will go to social media and direct message me and just put in the word blood sugar, I will send you a link to this course that we've talked about. Okay.
All right.
Or my phone number for my office is 208-218-8622. You can text that number, the word blood sugar, and just do it as one word, blood sugar, just put it together, and I will send you the same stuff.
Awesome. All right, Brady. Well, it was a good conversation. I appreciate you coming on the podcast and talking about blood glucose regulation and everything we covered. I wish you the best with the course. I think it's, it's simple foundational stuff, but I think we're at a point where we got to go back to the basics.
We do.
Even in our book, The Thyroid Debacle, that Kelly Halderman and I put out, people ask, like, where's the supplement protocols? I don't have them. I don't like protocols. What you need is foundational concepts, and they don't change whether you have a thyroid condition, whether you have a blood sugar condition. It doesn't matter what the condition is. All of those things are the result of compromise of these foundational concepts. So I'm glad you're taking one or two of these big concepts, physical fitness and dietary fitness, and helping people understand more about these from a real basic foundational level so that they can get themselves started. So again, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Eric. It was an honor.